After 3 years of sacrificing my youth, my money, and my career to care for my sick father, he left the entire inheritance to my golden child sister, who had only bothered to show up 6 weeks ago. I stood in the middle of our family living room, calmly placed the power of attorney documents and the house keys on the mahogany coffee table, and smiled. "Congratulations," I said. But when my father read the letter I left behind, he completely lost it. "You cannot be serious," he shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. What he and his arrogant son-in-law did not know was that they had not just inherited a real estate empire. They had officially inherited a financial death sentence. Before I tell you how I legally handed them their own ruin, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever been pushed to the breaking point by the people who were supposed to protect you. My name is Naomi, and I am 32 years old. By day, I am a commercial real estate appraiser and a financial advisor, a woman who knows how to spot a bad investment from a mile away. But for the past 3 years, my primary job was surviving the hellscape of my own family. My father, Marcus, was a retired construction contractor who built his wealth from the ground up in Atlanta, Georgia. He was a proud, authoritarian man who measured a person's worth entirely by their outward appearance and their willingness to obey his every command. When he suffered a stroke 3 years ago, I did what a good daughter is expected to do. I packed up my independent life, moved back into his massive, historic mansion in the wealthy Buckhead neighborhood, and took over his daily care. I managed his medications, cooked his meals, drove him to endless physical therapy appointments, and quietly tried to keep his chaotic business affairs from completely collapsing. While I was drowning in the exhausting reality of being a full-time caregiver, my younger sister Chloe was living her absolute best life. At 28, Chloe was a social media influencer and a socialite, someone who had never worked a hard day in her life. She spent her time posting heavily edited photos from luxury resorts across Europe and shopping at high-end boutiques. Chloe had always been our father's favorite. She was the golden child, the one who knew exactly how to speak softly, smile brightly, and act perfectly helpless so that men would rush to take care of her. Her lifestyle was entirely funded by her husband, Brad. Brad was a 34-year-old finance bro working in the tech startup scene. He was a wealthy white man who loved to insert himself into our African-American family dynamics with a suffocating level of condescension. He walked around our father's house as if he already owned it, constantly offering unsolicited advice and treating me like I was the hired help, rather than a successful professional in my own right. Together, Brad and Chloe painted the perfect picture of success and compliance that my father desperately craved, while I was just the gritty, outspoken workhorse stuck behind the scenes doing all the heavy lifting. The tension in the house had been building for 6 weeks, ever since Brad and Chloe flew in from the West Coast. Brad claimed he had some business meetings in Atlanta, but I knew the real reason they were suddenly so interested in visiting. They had caught wind that the city was planning to rezone several commercial districts near Buckhead, and they smelled money. They also knew my father was finally recovering enough to start making permanent decisions about his estate. From the moment they dragged their designer luggage through the front door, they began a relentless campaign of psychological warfare. Chloe would sit by our father's bed holding his hand and weeping dramatically about how much she missed him, while Brad would stand in the corner, casually dropping comments about how poorly the house was being maintained and how my real estate appraisals were just small potatoes compared to the massive corporate acquisitions he handled daily. The real betrayal, the moment that set my revenge into motion, happened exactly 3 days before I handed over those keys. It was a Tuesday morning. I had been up since 5, organizing my father's medical bills and preparing his morning tea. The house felt unusually quiet, a heavy, suffocating silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I carried the silver tea tray down the long hallway and pushed open the heavy double doors leading to my father's private study. The study was a sprawling room lined with dark walnut bookshelves, smelling faintly of expensive leather and old cigars. My father was sitting behind his massive executive desk. He looked healthier and sharper than he had in years, but his eyes were cold and guarded. Seated in the plush guest chairs opposite the desk were Brad and Chloe. Brad was leaning back comfortably, one ankle resting casually on his knee, tapping a gold pen against his chin with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. Chloe sat right beside him, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the devoted, emotionally overwhelmed daughter to absolute perfection. But what made my stomach drop was the fourth person in the room. Standing next to my father's desk was his personal estate lawyer, a man who only ever showed up when major legal changes were happening. He was busy shuffling a thick stack of freshly printed documents into neat piles. I stepped into the room and set the tea tray down on a side table. The clink of the porcelain cup sounded abnormally loud. "What is going on here?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level as I looked from the lawyer to my father. Brad let out a sharp, condescending chuckle. "We are just doing a little necessary restructuring, Naomi," he said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "It is time we take some of the burden off your shoulders. You have been playing nurse for long enough. Chloe and I think it is time the adults handle the real business side of things." I ignored him entirely and kept my gaze fixed on my father. I asked, "What is going on, Dad?" "I am your legally appointed power of attorney. If there is a meeting happening regarding your estate or your assets, I should have been informed." My father did not flinch. He did not look guilty, and he certainly did not look grateful for the 3 years of my life I had just sacrificed to keep him alive. Instead, he looked at me with the same hard, judgmental stare he had used to cut me down my entire life. The stare that told me I was too abrasive, too independent, and simply not as lovable as Chloe. He slowly adjusted his posture, folded his hands over the pristine legal documents on his desk, and cleared his throat. "You have done your part, Naomi," my father said, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the study. "But things are changing today. I called the lawyer here because I'm officially revoking your power of attorney." The lawyer, a man who looked like he billed by the minute, pushed a thick stack of freshly printed papers across the polished walnut wood of the desk. My father did not even look down at the documents. He kept his dark eyes locked on mine, challenging me to break down. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to beg. That was always his game. He thrived on the emotional reactions of the people around him because it made him feel powerful. But I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me crack. The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he began reading the stipulations aloud. Effective immediately, Marcus was transferring the title of the $2.5 million Buckhead estate into an irrevocable family trust. The primary beneficiary and sole trustee of this new arrangement was Chloe. Along with the historic mansion, the controlling shares of the family construction firm, the very enterprise my grandfather had started and bled for, were being signed over entirely to her, and by extension of their marriage to Brad. I stared at the documents, watching the sharp black ink spell out my complete erasure from the family legacy. I thought about the endless nights I had sat at that exact same desk, sorting through past due notices, and negotiating aggressively with suppliers just to keep the construction company afloat when my father was lying in a hospital bed attached to a ventilator. I had spent thousands of hours poring over financial spreadsheets, fighting off creditors, and managing contractors while Chloe was busy curating her glamorous aesthetic on Instagram from a yacht in Santorini. Now those same assets were being handed to her on a silver platter as a reward for simply showing up when the hard work was already done. Brad could not contain his excitement. He stood up from his plush leather chair, buttoning his custom-tailored suit jacket, with a gesture so practiced it made my stomach turn. He walked over to my father and placed a firm, masculine hand on his shoulder. "We have got it from here, Marcus. You just need to focus on resting and enjoying your retirement." Then Brad turned to face me. His pale blue eyes swept over my practical work clothes, his mouth twisting into a highly patronizing smile. "Do not take this personally, Naomi. Your father and I had a long talk about the future of the company and the preservation of the estate. You have been an absolute saint for taking care of his physical needs. We all appreciate your service as a caregiver. But managing an enterprise of this magnitude requires a certain type of business mindset." He took a step closer, invading my personal space to assert his dominance. You are a commercial appraiser. You look at buildings and write reports about their current condition. That is a solid, safe little job. But Chloe and I deal in venture capital. We deal in scaling aggressive acquisitions. To survive and thrive in the current Atlanta real estate market, this family needs visionary leadership. We cannot afford to have someone playing it safe or getting bogged down by emotions. You simply do not have the killer instinct to multiply this kind of wealth. I watched his jaw move, listening to the sheer audacity of a man who had married into my family, trying to explain my own father's business to me. He spoke grandly about scaling acquisitions, entirely unaware that the only reason there was a company left to acquire was because I had spent the last 36 months playing a brutal game of financial defense. Before I could respond, Chloe jumped into the conversation. She fluttered out of her chair, rushed around the heavy desk, and threw her arms around our father's neck. "Daddy," she cried, her voice trembling with perfect theatrical precision, "you did not have to do all this for us. Brad and I just want you to be healthy. We just want to make you proud and protect the family name the way it deserves to be protected." My father patted her manicured hand, his harsh and critical expression melting into a sickening display of affection. "You have always made me proud, sweet girl. You married a strong man who knows how the world works. You understand what it takes to maintain our status in this city." Chloe wiped a non-existent tear from her cheek and turned her doe-eyed gaze toward me. She stepped forward and reached out, trying to grab my hands in a show of sisterly solidarity. "Naomi, please try to understand where Daddy is coming from. You look so exhausted. You have let yourself go completely over the last 3 years. Daddy saw how incredibly stressed you were, and Brad and I just want to relieve you of this heavy burden. You can finally have your personal life back. In fact, Brad and I talked about it this morning, and we are more than happy to keep you on the family payroll. You can stay in your room upstairs and continue managing his medications and his special diet. We will even pay you a professional nurse's salary. It is the absolute least we can do for you." The offer was expertly designed to humiliate me. They were standing in the very house I had shielded from foreclosure, offering to pay me an hourly wage to be a glorified servant in my own childhood home. They wanted me to sit quietly on the sidelines and watch as they paraded around wealthy social circles, spending the money they believed they had just secured. My father leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the desk. "You should take the deal, Naomi. Your sister is being incredibly generous to you. You never had the charm or the social grace to run the company anyway. You are too stubborn. You are too harsh. You do not know how to play the game and make people like you. Chloe knows how to build important relationships. Brad knows how to step into a boardroom and close a massive deal, sign the legal acknowledgement papers, and go make us some lunch." The lawyer nervously pushed a final piece of paper toward the edge of the desk. It was a formal acknowledgement of the transfer, a legal receipt stating that I understood my proxy was fully revoked and that I surrendered all legal rights to contest the new trust arrangement. The room fell completely silent. They were all waiting for my reaction. My father expected me to yell, to argue about fairness, to list off every single sacrifice I had made for him over the years. Brad expected me to cry or throw a dramatic tantrum, proving his sexist point that I was far too emotional for the harsh world of business. Chloe expected me to storm out of the room in a fit of raging jealousy so she could play the victim and comfort our father about his difficult eldest daughter. But I gave them absolutely nothing. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I did not flinch or gasp. I just stood there, breathing evenly, my face transforming into an unreadable stone-cold mask. I looked at my father, taking in the arrogant and self-righteous tilt of his chin. I looked at Chloe, whose fake sympathy was beginning to waver under the intense weight of my direct stare. I looked at Brad, whose smug, victorious smile slowly started to falter as the seconds ticked by without a single word of protest from me. The heavy silence stretched on, thickening the air in the study, until it became suffocating. The lawyer nervously adjusted his tie again, glancing frantically between my father and me. Brad shifted his weight awkwardly from one foot to the other, the quiet confidence visibly draining out of his posture. They had prepared for a massive battle. They had brought out their heavy artillery ready to crush my spirit, validate their own greed, and watch me break into pieces. They did not realize that my silence was not a sign of defeat. My dead silence was the eerie, terrifying calm that rolls in just before a Category 5 hurricane tears the roof off a house. I slowly broke my gaze away from my father and shifted my attention to the lawyer. I stepped forward, the sharp click of my heels echoing off the hardwood floor like a gavel striking a sound block. I reached out and took the gold pen right out of Brad's hand before he could even register the movement. I did not bother reading the fine print of the acknowledgement form. I already knew exactly what it said because I was the one who had silently anticipated this exact maneuver for weeks. I pressed the nib to the paper and signed my name with a smooth, aggressive flourish. I pushed the signed document back toward the lawyer, whose eyes were wide with poorly concealed shock at my complete lack of resistance. Next, I unclasped my leather work tote. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, laminated manila folder. Inside was the original court-stamped medical and financial power of attorney, the very document that had chained me to this house, to this demanding man, and to this miserable existence for 36 agonizing months. I pulled the heavy parchment out and dropped it squarely in the center of my father's desk. Then I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my heavy key ring. I detached my personal car key, sliding it safely into my palm, and let the rest of the ring drop directly onto the legal paperwork. The heavy brass keys hit the polished wood with a loud final clatter. There were the keys to the front gate, the keys to the front door, the keys to the company filing cabinets, the keys to the estate's storage units, and the key to the master safe. I looked back at my father, whose arrogant, self-righteous posture had suddenly gone completely rigid. He was staring at the keys like they were venomous snakes ready to strike. He had geared up for a massive dramatic war. He had expected me to fight tooth and nail for my place in the family hierarchy, but instead I was giving him a swift, unconditional surrender. Since my proxy is officially revoked, I said, my voice echoing with a chilling, absolute calmness that seemed to lower the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. I am also officially tendering my immediate resignation as your primary caregiver, your estate manager, and your financial shield. I am legally washing my hands of you, Marcus. I will no longer schedule your daily physical therapy. I will no longer drive to the pharmacy to fill your heart medications. I will not negotiate with your private nurses, and I will certainly not be cooking your strict low-sodium meals. I turned my gaze to Chloe. The fake theatrical tears had completely dried up on her perfectly contoured face. Her jaw was slightly slack, her eyes darting between the keys on the desk and my cold expression. She was beginning to realize that taking over the estate did not just mean throwing lavish dinner parties and taking selfies by the pool. It meant actual grueling work. He requires his blood pressure checked twice a day, Chloe. I told her, my tone polite but razor sharp. His physical therapist charges $400 an hour, and they expect to be paid upon arrival. His cardiologist requires weekly check-ins, and if he misses a dose of his blood thinner, he could have another stroke. You wanted the responsibility of being the devoted, loving daughter. You wanted the title, the house, and the company. You got it all. He is 100% your problem now. Brad scoffed loudly, stepping forward to puff out his chest. He was desperately trying to regain the upper hand and mask the sudden heavy tension that had just suffocated the room. Do not act like you are doing us some huge favor by walking away, Naomi, he sneered, crossing his arms. We have the capital to hire the absolute best medical staff in the state of Georgia. We do not need your amateur nursing skills or your bitter attitude. We are taking this family empire to the next level, and you are just mad that you do not get to be a part of the ride. I looked at Brad, taking in his tailored suit, his perfectly styled hair, and his absolute blinding delusion. I let a slow, razor-thin smile break across my face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated pity. I am sure you are, Brad, I replied softly. I am sure a visionary venture capitalist like yourself will do absolute wonders with the company. I did not wait for his response. I simply turned my back on all of them. I did not pack a bag. I did not walk upstairs to my old bedroom to gather the clothes I had left in the closet. I had already moved my most important personal belongings and crucial financial documents out of the house weeks ago, bit by bit, under the cover of darkness. I simply walked out of the study, leaving the heavy mahogany double doors wide open behind me. As I walked down the grand marble hallway of the Buckhead mansion for the very last time, I did not look at the expensive artwork hanging on the walls. I did not look up at the imported crystal chandeliers. I felt absolutely no nostalgia for the home I had grown up in. I felt nothing but an overwhelming, intoxicating wave of relief. The invisible, suffocating chains of familial obligation that had bound my wrists for 3 years were finally shattered. I stepped out the front door and walked down the sweeping circular driveway toward my car. The Georgia sun was blindingly bright, and the warm afternoon air felt impossibly crisp and clean in my lungs. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove my car straight through the wrought iron gates without shedding a single tear. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I was entirely, beautifully free. Back inside the dark, oppressive walls of the study, Brad confidently stepped forward and scooped the heavy brass keys off the polished desk. He tossed them in the air and caught them with one hand, flashing a triumphant, arrogant smirk at his wife. He had won the ultimate prize. He had successfully manipulated a sick old man, ousted the stubborn older sister, and secured the keys to a multi-million-dollar kingdom. He felt like the smartest, most powerful man in Atlanta. What the arrogant finance bro absolutely did not know, as he gleefully pocketed those keys and patted his father-in-law on the back, was that he had not just inherited a glorious real estate empire. He had just legally signed his name to a catastrophic, inescapable financial death sentence. The reality of that financial death sentence had not been built overnight. It was forged in the dark, grueling trenches of the past 36 months. 3 years ago, before the stroke, my father was a titan of Atlanta real estate. When he suddenly fell ill, the golden facade of our family cracked, but only I was expected to pick up the pieces and bleed to keep them together. My daily existence became a punishing, relentless dual life that left me physically drained and emotionally hollowed out. By day, I was a highly sought-after commercial real estate appraiser. My brain was hardwired for calculating cap rates, analyzing multi-million-dollar zoning reports, and assessing massive industrial warehouses across the state of Georgia. I commanded respect in boardrooms and on active construction sites. But long before the sun ever came up, my professional identity was entirely erased. At 5 o'clock every single morning, I was not a financial advisor. I was a glorified orderly trapped in a beautifully gilded cage. My mornings always began with the hum of medical equipment and the sharp clinical smell of antiseptic soap replacing the rich scent of the expensive cigars my father used to smoke. I would walk into his expansive master suite to begin the grueling physical labor of keeping him alive. I had to brace my feet, lock my knees, and use every ounce of strength in my body to lift his heavy, dead weight from the mattress to his specialized wheelchair. I was the one who stripped off his soiled sheets. I was the one who carefully wiped down his body with warm washcloths when he was too weak to stand in the shower. I sorted his endless complex array of pills into tiny plastic compartments, perfectly balancing his blood thinners, statins, and beta blockers. If I made a single mistake with his dosages, he could easily suffer another massive stroke. I held his life in my hands every single day. How did Marcus repay this life-saving, exhausting dedication with pure, unfiltered contempt? The psychological abuse was not explosive. It was a slow, daily drip of poison designed to break my spirit and keep me entirely under his control. I remember one specific Tuesday morning, about a year into his recovery. I was kneeling on the bathroom tiles, carefully washing his swollen feet. I had dark circles carved deeply under my eyes from staying up until 2 in the morning to finish a commercial appraisal report, desperately trying to generate enough income to keep the estate's lights on. I was wearing a simple, practical gray pantsuit, my hair pulled back into a tight, no-nonsense bun, because I had an aggressive site inspection scheduled for later that afternoon. My father looked down at me, his lip curling in absolute disgust. He swatted my hand away roughly, nearly knocking the basin of warm water onto the floor. "You look like a maid," He spat, his voice raspy, but dripping with venom. "You are an absolute embarrassment to this family name. You walk around my house looking like you belong in the mailroom of some second-rate firm. No wonder you do not have a husband to take care of you. Who would want a woman who looks so thoroughly worn out?" Before I could even process the sting of his words, he grabbed his tablet with his functioning hand and aggressively tapped the screen. He shoved the bright display directly into my face. "Look at your sister," he barked. On the screen was a fresh Instagram post from Chloe. She was standing on the deck of a chartered yacht in Monaco, wearing a flowing, brightly colored designer sundress that had undoubtedly been purchased with the emergency credit card I was quietly paying the minimum balance on. Her makeup was flawless. Her hair was perfectly styled to catch the Mediterranean breeze. She looked radiant, carefree, and absolutely untouched by the nightmare reality of our father's failing health. That is what a woman of our status is supposed to look like. My father told me, his eyes shining with profound pride as he looked at the digital image of his youngest daughter. She represents Black excellence. She carries herself with class and beauty. She knows how to attract wealth and maintain the image of this family. "You are just rough and bitter. You have no grace, Naomi." The words cut deep, slicing right through my exhaustion. In the high society circles of Atlanta, image was currency. My father had fought aggressively against systemic barriers for decades to build his construction empire. He had clawed his way to the top of a white-dominated industry, and because of that intense struggle, he viewed his daughters not as human beings, but as trophies meant to display his ultimate victory. Chloe was his shining, flawless diamond. She reflected exactly what he wanted the world to see: wealth, leisure, and absolute perfection. I, on the other hand, was the uncomfortable reflection of the grit and the dirt required to maintain that wealth. Despite having the actual brains, the relentless work ethic, and the financial acumen that perfectly mirrored his own, I was entirely worthless to him because I was not a decorative object. I was too practical, too outspoken, and simply too exhausted from keeping him alive to be a beautiful trophy. He never once thanked me for wiping his body or feeding him his meals. He acted as though I owed him my absolute servitude simply for the privilege of being born. When I secured a massive appraisal contract working late into the night at the kitchen island just to generate enough cash to pay the estate's skyrocketing property taxes, he complained that the sound of my typing was keeping him awake. He told me my ambition was aggressive and unnatural for a woman. He deliberately tore down my confidence daily, creating a psychological prison where I was constantly striving for an approval he had already decided to withhold forever. The outside world saw a proud, successful Black patriarch who had built a legacy. They saw a sprawling, beautiful estate in Buckhead and assumed our family was the epitome of generational wealth and unity. But behind those heavy mahogany doors, it was a cruel dictatorship. The pristine mansion was a house of horrors where a narcissistic father slowly and methodically drained the life, the finances, and the youth from the only child who actually loved him enough to stay. He weaponized my loyalty and turned it into my greatest weakness, entirely unaware that the very pressure he applied to break me was actually forging me into something unbreakable. The truth about his financial ruin did not come to me in a neat, organized file. It hit me like a freight train on a rainy Tuesday evening, exactly 14 months into my tenure as his caretaker. I was sitting at the massive marble kitchen island, surrounded by a mountain of unopened mail that my father's previous assistant had carelessly shoved into a box before quitting. I sliced open a thick, certified letter from a major commercial lender in Atlanta. My eyes scanned the bold, aggressive print, and the air immediately left my lungs. It was a final notice of default. The construction company was not just struggling, it was functionally bankrupt. My heart hammered against my ribs as I frantically tore open letter after letter. Past due notices from heavy machinery vendors, severe tax liens from the IRS, outstanding invoices from subcontractors who were threatening to sue. My father had been secretly bleeding money for years, long before the stroke had ever placed him in a wheelchair. He had taken out massive high-interest loans against the business just to maintain his flashy high society lifestyle. He had leveraged everything to keep up appearances at the country club, to keep his luxury cars in the driveway, and to keep funding Chloe's international shopping sprees. I grabbed the stack of default notices and marched straight down the hallway to his master bedroom. He was propped up on a mountain of plush pillows, watching a financial news network on his flat-screen television, as if he still had a seat at the table. I threw the papers directly onto his lap. The heavy cardstock scattered across his expensive duvet. "You are bankrupt," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of terror and absolute disbelief. "The company is drowning in debt. The bank is preparing to call in the loans on the equipment, and the IRS is preparing to put a lien on this very house. Why did you not tell me the truth when I took over your accounts?" My father did not look panicked. He did not look ashamed. He casually reached over, picked up the remote control, and muted the television. He looked at the devastating financial documents on his lap with mild annoyance, as if I had just spilled a glass of water, rather than expose the complete collapse of his empire. "It is a temporary cash flow problem," he said dismissively, waving his functioning hand. "The market shifted and my health took me out of the game for a few quarters. It is nothing I cannot handle once I am back on my feet." "You are not getting back on your feet anytime soon," I shot back, pointing at the medical machinery surrounding his bed. "You need round-the-clock care. The insurance company just denied the claim for your overnight nursing staff because you missed the premium payments 3 months ago. We do not have the liquid cash to keep this house running, let alone pay off these commercial lenders. We need to immediately sell this estate downsized to a single-story, accessible home and liquidate the remaining company assets to pay off the IRS." The moment the word "sell" left my lips, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He slammed his fist down on the mattress. "I am not selling my house!" he roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I built a fortress of black wealth in a city that wanted to see me fail. I fought tooth and nail against white developers and bankers who tried to shut me out of every major commercial deal in Atlanta. I will not be embarrassed in front of this entire city. I will not let them see me downsize into some pathetic middle-class neighborhood. You are not selling a single brick of my legacy." "Then how are we supposed to pay for your medical care?" I demanded, throwing my hands up in sheer frustration. "The private nurses cost $4,000 a week. The property taxes on this mansion are $25,000 a year. The money is gone, Marcus." He locked his dark, furious eyes onto mine. His gaze was perfectly calculated, shifting instantly from aggressive rage to a sharp, manipulative guilt trip. "The money is not gone, Naomi," he said, lowering his voice to a dangerous, demanding whisper. "You have a highly successful appraisal firm. You have a lucrative stock portfolio. You have savings. I broke my back working 80-hour weeks on construction sites to give you a life of absolute privilege. I paid for your education. I put the food in your mouth. And now when your father is lying in a hospital bed, paralyzed and vulnerable, you want to hand my legacy over to the bank because you are too selfish to write a check." I stared at him, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of his demand. "You want me to drain my personal business accounts to pay your debts?" "Family protects family," he sneered, using the very morals he had violated his entire life to corner me. "If I die because I do not have the proper medical staff, that blood is on your hands. If this house is foreclosed on, and your sister loses the family home, that failure rests entirely on your shoulders. You are going to step up, Naomi. You are going to pay the nurses, you are going to pay the property taxes, and you are going to keep this estate running until I am ready to return to the boardroom. If you do not, you are no daughter of mine." He weaponized my loyalty and my deeply ingrained sense of duty. He knew that despite his cruelty, I could not physically bring myself to let a sick, elderly man be thrown out onto the street. He knew I would not let the nurses walk out and leave him helpless. So I did exactly what he demanded. I stepped up and I began to bleed. I logged into my personal banking portal and started transferring my hard-earned wealth into his sinking ship. I paid the exorbitant overnight nursing fees out of my own pocket. I liquidated a massive chunk of my personal stock portfolio to cover the crushing property taxes on a 10,000-square-foot mansion that was mostly empty. I worked 16-hour days, taking on every single commercial appraisal contract I could find, just to generate enough cash to keep the utilities on and the creditors temporarily at bay. The most agonizing part of the financial drain was discovering where the absolute last drops of his company cash were actually going. While I was emptying my personal savings to buy his heart medication and pay the electricity bill, I intercepted a bank statement for his private checking account. He had a secret auto transfer set up. Every single month, the last remaining thousands of dollars from his business revenue were being wired directly into Chloe's account. He was actively funding her luxury vacations, her designer handbags, and her lavish lifestyle while forcing me to bear the brutal, grinding cost of his actual survival. When I confronted him about cutting Chloe off to pay for his own nurses, he refused outright. He claimed Chloe needed to maintain her social standing to secure a wealthy husband who could eventually invest in the family business. He called it a strategic necessity. I called it financial abuse. Month after month, the numbers in my bank accounts dropped lower and lower. I was working myself to the bone, isolated in a massive, sterile house, watching my own future evaporate to preserve the arrogant illusion of a man who despised me. I was entirely trapped. If I stopped paying, the medical staff would leave. The house would be seized, and the guilt of his collapse would be permanently pinned to my name. He had successfully manipulated my sense of morality, wrapping it around my throat like a vice. I was pushed completely into a brutal, suffocating financial corner, and the walls were closing in fast. The pressure finally shattered my last line of financial defense exactly 1 year ago. The IRS had issued a final, unyielding warning against the family construction firm. If a lump sum of $200,000 was not paid by the end of the week, they would aggressively seize the company's commercial assets and place an immediate lien on the Buckhead estate. I had absolutely no liquid cash left to give. My personal savings were completely decimated from paying for my father's around-the-clock private nurses, his expensive physical therapy, and the exorbitant utility bills required to keep his mansion running. I was left with only one desperate, terrifying option. I drove to my bank and took out a second mortgage on my own personal apartment. It was a beautiful, modern loft downtown that I had purchased with my very first major commercial real estate commission. That loft was my sanctuary. It was the only physical proof of my independent success, my true safe space away from my father's toxic, demanding grasp. Putting it on the line made me physically nauseous, but the twisted sense of duty ingrained in me since childhood forced my hand. I signed the heavy stack of banking paperwork, putting my own hard-earned credit on the chopping block, and wired the funds directly to the IRS to pull my father's legacy back from the absolute brink of destruction. Exhausted but deeply relieved that the immediate crisis was averted, I drove back to the Buckhead estate. I went straight to the Home Office and logged into my father's master banking portal to ensure the federal hold on his accounts had been officially lifted. The screen loaded and the IRS warning was gone. But instead of feeling a wave of relief, my blood instantly ran ice cold. A brand new massive pending wire transfer flashed across the screen. $50,000 had just been moved out of my father's final, strictly guarded emergency savings account. This was the absolute last reserve of liquid cash he possessed. I frantically clicked on the transaction details, expecting to see a desperately overdue payment to a heavy equipment supplier or a premium for his commercial insurance broker. Instead, the recipient name made the breath catch painfully in my throat. It was a premier ultra-luxury event planning agency based in Southern California. I marched straight down the hall and shoved open the doors to the formal dining room. Chloe was sitting at the long mahogany table surrounded by glossy bridal magazines, expensive silk fabric swatches, and a massive binder filled with floral arrangements. She was casually sipping sparkling water with a slice of lemon. My father sat at the head of the table in his wheelchair, looking over a 5-course catering menu with genuine, unbothered enthusiasm. "You withdrew $50,000, I demanded, my voice trembling with a terrifying mix of pure exhaustion and blinding rage. "I just mortgaged my own home, the only asset I have left in this entire world, to save your company from being seized by the federal government." I put my own neck on a financial chopping block for you today. And you just wired your last remaining dollar to a wedding planner in Malibu. Chloe rolled her perfectly lined eyes, looking highly annoyed that I was daring to interrupt her bridal fantasy. Naomi, please do not be so dramatic, she whined, inspecting her manicured nails. Daddy promised to pay for my dream wedding long before he ever got sick. You cannot seriously expect me to walk down the aisle in some cheap local banquet hall. Brad's family is flying in from Silicon Valley. We are hosting a sunset ceremony overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It has to be absolutely perfect. I stared at her, completely appalled by her profound disconnect from reality. Perfect, Chloe. We are bankrupt. Dad is broke. The only reason the electricity is on in this room right now is because I paid the bill yesterday. You are stealing the last of his survival money for a party. My father slammed his good hand violently against the dining table, rattling the fine china and silencing the room. Do not you dare raise your voice to me in my own house, he roared, his face contorting with absolute fury. Your sister is marrying into an elite circle. Brad comes from generational wealth. His parents have incredibly high expectations, and we are not going to look like a pathetic charity case in front of them. She needs to save face with her white in-laws. I fought my entire life to sit at their tables, and my daughter will not look like a peasant when she officially joins their family. I will not let your petty, jealous complaining ruin her special day. I stood there vibrating with anger. Save face. Marcus, you are functionally destitute. I am drowning in debt to keep you alive, and you are throwing away $50,000 on imported flowers and oceanfront views just to impress a bunch of arrogant tech investors who do not even care about you. My father leaned forward in his wheelchair, his dark eyes burning with pure, unadulterated contempt. You are the older sister, he spat, pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. You are supposed to sacrifice for this family. That is your role. You are built for hard work, Naomi, but Chloe is building alliances. Her marriage to Brad elevates all of us in society. You should be honored to do your part to ensure she gets the luxurious wedding she deserves. Stop complaining and do your job. I stood completely frozen, staring at the man I had sacrificed my entire life, my youth and my financial security to save. I looked at Chloe, who was already turning her attention back to her silk fabric swatches, completely unbothered by the fact that I had just risked losing my own home to fund her lavish vanity project. It was not a sudden explosion of anger. It was a quiet terminal realization. In that singular crystal-clear moment, the heavy, suffocating fog of familial obligation completely evaporated from my mind. The invisible chains of guilt and duty simply dissolved. I was not a daughter to them. I was not a sister. I was an ATM. I was a human shield, a disposable tool meant to absorb all the brutal financial damage so they could continue living their delusional, glamorous lives without a single scratch. They did not love me. They only loved what they could extract from me. A cold, absolute indignation settled deep into my bones, freezing over the years of desperate longing I had harbored for my father's approval. I realized right then that if I continued to play by their rules, I would die completely bankrupt and alone. It was time to stop playing the loyal daughter and start playing the ruthless businesswoman they had forced me to become. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the icy realization wash over me. The anger that had been boiling in my blood instantly crystallized into something cold, hard, and terrifyingly precise. I did not scream. I did not throw the glossy bridal magazines across the room. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the formal dining room, my posture straight and my mind racing with absolute clarity. I went directly to my father's home office. I bypassed the towering stacks of unpaid medical bills and sat at his heavy mahogany desk. I logged into the county property records database. I was a commercial real estate appraiser. My entire career was built on seeing value where other people only saw dirt. I knew my father's real estate portfolio better than he did at this point, and I knew exactly which asset I was going to strip from him. It was a 40-acre plot of abandoned industrial land on the outskirts of Atlanta. My father had purchased it nearly 2 decades ago with dreams of building a massive residential development, but the soil had been heavily contaminated by a previous chemical plant. The city had zoned it as strictly industrial, making it entirely useless for his luxury home-building ambitions. It had sat there for 20 years, a rusting, overgrown eyesore that generated nothing but property tax bills and city citations. My father hated that land. He considered it his greatest professional failure, but my commercial insider network had been buzzing with quiet, highly classified rumors for weeks. A massive global logistics company was desperately looking for a massive footprint near the interstate corridor, and they had the billions required to fast-track the environmental cleanup. I quickly drafted a legally binding transfer of deed and a total relinquishment of rights. I printed the heavy stack of legal documents, stapled them together, and marched right back down the hallway to the dining room. Chloe was still holding up a swatch of pale pink silk against the window light. My father was still glaring at the doorway, expecting me to return with an apology. Instead, I slapped the thick stack of legal papers down on the table right on top of Chloe's expensive wedding binder. "I just paid the IRS $200,000 to save your company and this house," I said, my voice completely stripped of any daughterly affection. "I used my own apartment as collateral. Since you have just proven that you consider my financial stability entirely disposable, I am officially requiring collateral of my own. You are going to sign this property transfer right now." My father grabbed the documents, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the first page. He adjusted his reading glasses, preparing to fight me tooth and nail for daring to demand a piece of his empire. But as his eyes landed on the specific address of the property, his hardened expression shifted into sheer mocking amusement. He looked up at me and let out a loud barking laugh. "The old chemical plant," he asked, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "You just leveraged your brand new downtown loft, your only real asset, and you want to secure that debt with a toxic, unbuildable wasteland." I kept my face perfectly blank. "I want a hard asset to secure my loan, Marcus," I replied, purposefully using his first name to establish that this was no longer a family discussion. This was a business transaction. "Sign the deed over to my personal LLC, or I will call my bank right now and report the IRS wire transfer as fraudulent coercion. The funds will be frozen, the federal agents will be at this door by tomorrow morning, and Chloe's beautiful Malibu wedding will be officially canceled." Chloe gasped, dropping her silk fabric swatch onto the floor. "Daddy, you cannot let her ruin my wedding." My father waved his hand, silencing her. He picked up his gold pen, still chuckling at what he believed was my profound business incompetence. He thought I was acting out of blind, emotional desperation. He genuinely believed I was so terrified of losing my money that I was willing to accept a completely worthless piece of garbage just to have my name on a deed. He thought he was winning. "You have always been a fool when it comes to real estate, Naomi," he sneered, dragging the pen across the signature lines with aggressive, sweeping strokes. "You think like a scavenger, not a developer. That land is a total liability. It has cost me more in municipal fines than it ever generated in revenue. If you want to burden your little appraisal firm with an environmental disaster, be my guest." He flipped to the last page, signed his name one final time, and then violently shoved the documents across the polished wood table. The heavy papers slid off the edge and hit my chest before scattering onto the floor. "Take that garbage dump and shut up," he growled, turning his wheelchair back toward the table to look at Chloe's catering menu. "Do not ever interrupt my conversations again, and do not ever threaten this family. You got your collateral. Now get back to work." I did not argue. I did not demand respect. I slowly bent down to the hardwood floor and gathered the scattered pages. I checked every single signature line to ensure the transfer was legally binding and absolute. He had surrendered all rights, all future claims, and all mineral and developmental ownership to me. As I stood back up, I smoothed the crisp white paper with my hands. My father and Chloe had already gone back to discussing whether they should serve filet mignon or sea bass at the reception. They completely ignored me, dismissing me as a pathetic, bitter woman who had just made the worst financial deal of her life. I looked down at the deed in my hands. The edges of my mouth twitched into a sharp, predatory smile. My eyes darkened with a cold, calculating satisfaction. They thought they had just handed me a liability. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the keys to a multi-million-dollar kingdom. I tucked the folder safely under my arm, turned my back on their delusional wedding planning, and walked quietly out of the room, knowing my ultimate revenge had just officially sprouted. The suffocating nightmare of their return began exactly 6 weeks ago. I was standing in the kitchen, carefully measuring out my father's evening medications, when the heavy oak front doors swung open. Brad and Chloe waltzed into the foyer, flanked by a hired car service carrying their matching Louis Vuitton luggage. There was no phone call. There was no text message warning me that they were abandoning their luxury life in Silicon Valley to descend upon Atlanta. Chloe immediately rushed down the hallway, her designer heels clicking frantically against the hardwood. She threw open the doors to my father's study, falling to her knees beside his wheelchair and burying her face in his lap. "Daddy," she sobbed, her voice ringing with the exact pitch of theatrical devotion he always demanded. "I missed you so much. We just could not bear being across the country while you are recovering. We had to come home and take care of you." My father stroked her hair, his eyes shining with absolute adoration. The prodigal daughter had returned, and she was immediately rewarded with his unconditional praise. Brad sauntered into the study right behind her, carrying a sleek leather briefcase and an air of unbearable, suffocating entitlement. He shook my father's hand firmly, leaning down to speak in a low masculine tone that completely shut me out of the interaction. "It is good to see you looking strong," Marcus, Brad said smoothly. "The West Coast is great, but we realize that family is everything. Plus, I need to keep an eye on my investments here in Atlanta. The market is shifting, and we need to make sure the family portfolio is positioned aggressively." I stood in the doorway, gripping a small plastic cup of pills, watching the performance unfold. They had not come home out of sudden, overwhelming familial devotion. They had come home because they had smelled the blood in the water. I knew exactly why they were suddenly so intensely interested in the Atlanta market. My commercial appraisal network had been buzzing with verified leaks for weeks. The city council was quietly finalizing a massive multi-billion-dollar rezoning project that would drastically expand the commercial boundaries right around the Buckhead district. The property values of the surrounding estates, including my father's massive mansion, were about to skyrocket exponentially. Brad and Chloe had caught wind of the upcoming zoning changes, and they had rushed back to secure their place at the table before my father's failing health forced a sudden liquidation of the estate. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere in the house shifted from isolated and grueling to completely overwhelmingly toxic. Brad acted as if he had already been handed the deed to the property. He set up a makeshift office in the formal dining room, spreading his dual monitors and financial reports across the mahogany table where my father used to host his construction partners. Every single time I walked through the dining room to retrieve a glass of water or fetch my father's medical chart, Brad made sure to corner me. He treated me like a poorly performing intern who needed constant, aggressive micromanagement. "So Naomi," Brad drawled one evening, leaning back in his chair and swirling a glass of my father's most expensive scotch. "I was looking over the recent appraisal report you submitted for that retail complex downtown. You used a capitalization rate of 6.5%. Do you really think that is an aggressive enough valuation in this current economic climate? Because out in the valley, we would leverage that asset completely differently. We would strip the equity, refinance the core structure, and reinvest the liquid capital into high-yield tech startups. Your approach is just so incredibly slow and conservative." I stopped walking, turning to face him. "My appraisal was based on the actual verifiable income data of the property, Brad," I replied, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "I do not deal in speculative equity stripping. I deal in hard physical assets that actually generate revenue, the kind of revenue that keeps the electricity running in this house." He laughed, a sharp, highly patronizing sound that grated against my exhausted nerves. "That is the fundamental difference between us, Naomi," he sneered, taking another sip of his stolen scotch. "You are stuck down in the dirt, looking at the physical bricks and the concrete. You are bogged down by the boring operational details. I look at the macro-level strategy. I look at the exponential growth potential. You are just a localized appraiser. I am a visionary capitalist. It is a completely different tier of business intelligence. You just do not have the aggressive mindset required to scale a multi-million-dollar enterprise. He deliberately used financial jargon and aggressive corporate buzzwords to belittle my career, acting as though my grueling life-saving work was nothing more than a pathetic, small-minded hobby. He completely ignored the fact that my so-called conservative approach had just saved my father from federal tax evasion charges. His presence in the house was an absolute suffocating nightmare. He occupied every room with his booming voice, his endless conference calls, and his unearned arrogance. He criticized the brand of coffee I bought. He complained that the private nurses I hired were not deferential enough to him. He even had the audacity to suggest that I was spending too much of my father's money on premium medical supplies, heavily implying that I was financially mismanaging the estate, while he was aggressively positioning himself to take it over. The air in the mansion grew impossibly thick, filled with the constant crushing pressure of a man who firmly believed he was infinitely superior to me, completely unaware that I was already quietly cataloging his every move. The psychological manipulation did not happen all at once. It was a slow, methodical poisoning of my father's already fragile trust, orchestrated beautifully by Chloe's theatrical tears and Brad's corporate doublespeak. They did not just want to occupy the house. They wanted to completely rewrite the narrative of the past 3 years. They needed my father to believe that I was not his savior but his captor. It started with quiet conversations behind closed doors. I would walk down the long carpeted hallway carrying fresh linens or a tray of hot food, only to hear the unmistakable sound of Chloe weeping softly by my father's bedside. I would pause just outside the heavy oak doors listening as she fed his worst paranoias. "Daddy, I am just so worried about you," Chloe would whimper, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. "Naomi is always so angry. She treats you like a burden. And Brad was looking over some of the banking statements you left on the desk. He is terrified for you, Daddy. She made you sign over that 40-acre industrial plot when you were heavily medicated. She is quietly stripping your assets while pretending to be your nurse." Then Brad would swoop in, playing the role of the sharp, protective financial savior. He would pull up a chair right next to my father's wheelchair, open his sleek silver laptop, and project complex, completely fabricated spreadsheets onto the television screen. "Marcus, I want to talk to you man to man," Brad would say, using a tone of deep, respectful camaraderie that he knew my father was absolutely desperate for. "I have analyzed the estate's cash flow over the last 12 months. Naomi's strategy is highly suspicious. She is intentionally depreciating your estate's liquidity. She is isolating your capital and paying off the wrong debts so she can eventually claim insolvency and take over the primary trust as your sole conservator. I see this exact same tactic in hostile corporate acquisitions in Silicon Valley all the time. She is bleeding you dry so she can swoop in and steal the empire you built." My father was a man whose entire identity rested on control and dominance. The thought of his own daughter outsmarting him, of someone quietly executing a hostile takeover of his life's work, struck the exact nerve Brad was aiming for. What made the manipulation so incredibly effective was the messenger. Brad was a wealthy white venture capitalist. For my father, a black man who had spent 4 decades fighting for a seat at the table in a segregated old money Southern real estate market, Brad represented the ultimate validation. Having a son-in-law like Brad, treat him as a business equal, validating his paranoid suspicions with corporate terminology, was an intoxicating drug my father simply could not resist. Within a matter of days, the shift in my father's demeanor was absolute and terrifying. The man who had previously demanded my constant presence suddenly treated me like a convicted embezzler. The daily routine transformed into a psychological minefield. When I brought him his morning heart medications, he refused to take the pills from my hand. He demanded that Chloe count them out in front of him, loudly accusing me of trying to over-medicate him to keep him docile. When I handed him the weekly grocery receipts to log into the household ledger, he snatched them out of my hand and demanded that Brad audit every single item, accusing me of skimming money off the top to fund my own real estate business. I was no longer his daughter, or his caregiver. In his mind, completely poisoned by Brad and Chloe's relentless whispering campaign, I was a financial parasite. One particularly brutal evening, I walked into the dining room to find Brad sitting at the head of the table, flipping through the private medical invoices I had paid using the last of my personal savings. My father was seated next to him, glaring at me the moment I crossed the threshold. "You are done handling my accounts, Naomi." My father spat, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Brad is taking over the financial oversight of this estate effective immediately. He knows how to negotiate with these healthcare providers. You have been letting them overcharge me for months because you are too weak and inexperienced to push back. You are bleeding my legacy dry." Legacy. I stood my ground, keeping my face perfectly neutral. "I paid those invoices out of my own pocket." "Marcus," I reminded him, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline pounding in my ears. "If Brad wants to take over the financial oversight, he can start by reimbursing my bank account." Brad let out a harsh, mocking laugh, tossing the invoices onto the table. "Stop playing the victim, Naomi. We all know you only paid those bills to establish a paper trail for your eventual claim against the estate. It is a classic equity grab, but your free ride is over. I am legally auditing every single transaction you have made since you moved into this house. We are going to find every dime you stole." I did not defend myself. I did not waste my breath trying to convince a delusional man and a greedy opportunist of my innocence. I simply turned and walked back to my room, my mind rapidly calculating the legal implications of their threats. I knew my accounting was flawless. I knew every penny I had spent was documented legal and entirely for my father's benefit. But their accusations were not about uncovering the truth. They were about establishing a false narrative to justify completely cutting me out. The true danger did not fully materialize until a damp, overcast Tuesday afternoon. I was in my home office finishing up a commercial appraisal draft when I heard the heavy crunch of gravel in the circular driveway. I stood up and looked through the window blinds. A sleek black luxury sedan had pulled up to the front steps. A tall, distinguished man in a dark charcoal suit stepped out carrying a thick leather briefcase. I recognized him instantly. He was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless, high-powered estate planning law firms in Atlanta. He was the attorney my father only called when he was preparing to make permanent, earth-shattering changes to his corporate structure or his personal will. A cold, sharp alarm blared in my mind. The red alert had officially been triggered. Brad and Chloe had done it. They had successfully weaponized my father's pride, his paranoia, and his deep-seated need for elite white corporate validation. They had convinced a man who was already standing on the edge of total financial ruin to hand over the keys to a sinking ship. They were about to rewrite the entire legal structure of the family trust, stripping me of the power of attorney and placing the full weight of the estate squarely onto their own shoulders. I watched from the window as Brad eagerly opened the front door to greet the lawyer, shaking his hand with a wide, triumphant smile. They thought they were locking me out of my own inheritance. They had absolutely no idea they were actively, enthusiastically marching straight toward their own financial slaughter. The high-powered attorney remained sealed inside my father's study for exactly 4 hours and 12 minutes. I sat perfectly still in the darkness of my home office, listening to the muffled, self-important cadence of Brad's voice bleeding through the heavy walls. I did not need to press my ear to the door to know what they were orchestrating. They were legally binding my father's hands, drafting the exact trust documents that would officially transfer the entire estate into their greedy, inexperienced palms. When the front doors finally clicked shut and the lawyer's luxury sedan crunched down the gravel driveway, a thick, celebratory atmosphere settled over the mansion. I waited until 2 o'clock in the morning. The sprawling Buckhead estate was completely pitch-black, silent, except for the rhythmic, mechanical hum of my father's oxygen concentrator, echoing faintly from the master wing. My throat was dry. I slipped out of my office and made my way down the sweeping spiral staircase, moving with the silent, practiced steps of someone who had navigated these hardwood floors through countless sleepless nights. I was only heading to the kitchen for a glass of water, but as I approached the heavy archway of the formal dining room, The soft amber glow of the under-cabinet lighting stopped me in my tracks. I pressed my back flush against the cold plaster of the butler's pantry, holding my breath. Brad and Chloe were sitting at the massive marble kitchen island. An expensive bottle of my father's vintage champagne was already half empty between them. They were speaking in hushed conspiratorial whispers, completely unaware that the very woman they were plotting against was standing less than 10 feet away in the shadows. We pushed the lawyer for an expedited transfer, Brad said, the clinking of crystal glasses cutting through the quiet night. The old man was hesitant at first, but you played it perfectly, Chloe. The moment you started crying about Naomi isolating him, he folded completely. The trust documents will be finalized by Friday. The second the ink is dry, we pull the trigger. I peered around the edge of the doorway. Chloe was swirling the champagne in her glass, a lazy, satisfied smile stretching across her face. I cannot believe it was actually that easy, she whispered, taking a slow sip. Daddy is so desperate to keep you around, Brad. He is practically throwing the deed at us just to prove he still has the upper hand against Naomi. But what happens after Friday? Are you absolutely sure your contact is ready to move on the property? Brad leaned forward, his elbows resting on the marble, his eyes gleaming with sheer, unadulterated greed. My guy at Sterling Corporate Holdings has the cash liquid and ready to deploy, Brad replied smoothly. They are discreetly acquiring massive residential lots in this zip code for a luxury commercial development. The second the deed transfers to the new family trust, we sell this entire estate to Sterling in a private off-market deal. They are offering $3 million in pure cash, Chloe. $3 million. We swallow the assets whole before the old man even realizes what hit him. A cold shock radiated from the base of my neck down to my fingertips. They had absolutely no intention of living in the Buckhead mansion. They had no intention of managing the family construction firm or preserving our father's so-called legacy. They were executing a quick, brutal liquidation. Brad was planning to flip my father's prized estate to a corporate developer the moment he legally secured the title. And what about Naomi? Chloe asked, her voice entirely devoid of sisterly affection. She is going to lose her mind when she finds out we are selling the house right out from under her. She thinks she owns this place just because she changes his bedpans. Brad let out a low, dark chuckle. We kick her out the exact same day we sign the closing papers with Sterling, he sneered. We give her 24 hours to pack her cheap suits and get off our property. She has no legal leg to stand on once the power of attorney is revoked. We completely cut her out of the capital gains. She does not get a single dime of that $3 million. I pressed my fingernails into my palms, the physical sting grounding me against the overwhelming wave of betrayal. But the true horror of their conversation had not even reached its peak. What about Daddy? Chloe asked, setting her glass down. If we sell the house to a commercial developer next month, where is he supposed to go? He needs round-the-clock medical care. We cannot exactly bring him back to our condo in Silicon Valley. He requires way too much attention. There was not a single ounce of sorrow in her voice. She spoke about the father who worshipped the ground she walked on as if he were a broken appliance she was trying to dispose of. Brad reached across the island and took her hand, his tone shifting into cold, calculated pragmatism. We find a state-run medical facility somewhere outside the city limits, Brad stated matter-of-factly. We will use a tiny fraction of the sale money to cover his first few months of care, and then we let his Medicare kick in. We are not sacrificing our youth and our new capital to play nursemaid Chloe. He is dying anyway. We have to seize control of the cash before he passes away. Otherwise, the assets get locked up in probate court for years, and Naomi will definitely try to fight us for her half. We take the $3 million, now we put him in a home, and we fly back to the West Coast as multimillionaires. Chloe did not gasp. She did not defend the man who had funded her luxurious lifestyle, the man who had verbally abused me daily, just to protect her fragile ego. She simply nodded, taking another long sip of champagne. You are right, she agreed coldly. I deserve that money for having to put up with his constant demands. He is exhausting to be around. We will drop him off at a facility, sign the paperwork, and finally be free of this miserable family drama. I stood frozen in this dark pantry. The sheer, breathtaking evil of their plan temporarily stopped my heart. They were going to strip my father of his precious legacy, sell his beloved fortress to a corporate bulldozer, and dump his paralyzed body into a cheap state-funded nursing home. Chloe was willing to throw the father who adored her into a sterile, lonely room just to secure a cash payout for her arrogant husband. For 5 seconds, a wave of profound, suffocating shock threatened to bring me to my knees. The betrayal was so deep, so fundamentally grotesque, that it defied basic human morality. But then the shock stopped. It did not turn into grief. It did not turn into a desperate urge to burst into the kitchen and scream at them to stop. The shock melted away completely, leaving behind a terrifying absolute calmness that settled into my bones like solid ice. My breathing slowed. My heartbeat leveled out. A dark, razor-sharp clarity washed over my entire mind. I realized the fatal flaw in their perfect, ruthless master plan. Brad was a venture capitalist who dealt in surface-level projections. He had looked at the massive Buckhead estate and seen $3 million in pure, unencumbered profit. He thought my father owned the house free and clear. He thought the family construction business was a gold mine waiting to be liquidated. He had absolutely no idea that the estate was leveraged to the hilt. He had no idea that the mansion had been mortgaged 3 times over to pay off federal tax liens. He did not know that the construction company was currently carrying a $2 million commercial debt load that I had been personally managing and suppressing through my own private financial maneuvers. Brad and Chloe thought they were executing a brilliant hostile takeover of a multi-million-dollar empire. They thought they were swallowing my father's assets whole. They did not realize they were unhinging their jaws to swallow a live hand grenade. I backed away from the kitchen doorway, moving without making a single sound. I did not need water anymore. I walked back up the spiral staircase, my posture perfectly straight, my mind operating with the cold precision of a predator watching its prey step willingly into a steel trap. They wanted to kick me out. They wanted to take on the legal ownership of the family trust. I was going to let them have exactly what they wanted. I was going to hand them the keys, step back, and watch the entire crushing weight of my father's hidden financial ruin pull them straight down to the bottom of the ocean. The morning sun rose over the Buckhead estate, casting long, sharp shadows across the meticulously manicured lawn. I walked into the kitchen at exactly 6 o'clock, moving with the practiced mechanical efficiency of a woman who had already mourned the death of her family and was now solely focused on the cold business of survival. I brewed my father's herbal tea and prepared his low-sodium breakfast plate, just as I had done for the past 1,000 days. I did not slam the heavy oak cabinets. I did not glare at the empty, expensive champagne bottles left scattered on the marble island by Brad and Chloe the night before. I was the absolute picture of compliance. Brad sauntered into the kitchen an hour later, wearing expensive silk pajamas and a smug, victorious grin. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter watching me wash dishes with an air of unbearable superiority. He made a snide, passive-aggressive comment about how I needed to start packing my bags soon because the new estate management would be making sweeping changes by the weekend. I just smiled, a bland, unreadable corporate smile, and told him I had a very busy day of commercial appraisals ahead of me. Chloe walked in moments later, complaining loudly about the lingering smell of hospital-grade sanitizers in the hallway. I nodded politely, picked up my leather briefcase and walked out the front door without a single word of argument. I did not drive to a construction site. I drove straight to a sleek, glass-paneled high-rise in Midtown Atlanta that housed the elite offices of Vivian Carter. Vivian was a ruthless, highly connected corporate attorney whom I had kept entirely separate from my father's legal team. She was my personal financial shield, a woman who understood the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of commercial real estate debt better than anyone in the state of Georgia. I had hired her 2 years ago when I first realized my father's construction empire was bleeding cash, knowing that I would eventually need an exit strategy to protect my own assets. I sat in Vivian's plush office overlooking the city skyline and placed a thick stack of financial ledgers directly on her glass desk. I told her that Marcus was officially revoking my power of attorney on Friday. I explained that he was transferring the entire estate along with the family construction firm into a brand new trust controlled exclusively by Chloe and Brad. Vivian looked at me, her sharp, intelligent eyes scanning the top sheets of the documents. She asked if my sister and her arrogant husband actually knew about the leveraged debt. I told her they thought the estate was a pristine gold mine worth $3 million in pure, unencumbered cash. They were completely unaware of the $2 million commercial debt load, the triple mortgaged mansion, and the lingering federal tax liens. Vivian leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face, the look of a predator recognizing another predator's brilliant strategy. She explained the precise legal maneuver we were going to execute. For the past 3 years, my father's crumbling empire had only survived because my highly successful personal business, LLC, was acting as the sole guarantor on his massive commercial loans. My pristine credit score and my company's verified cash reserves were the only financial dam holding back the crushing floodwaters of foreclosure. By forcefully taking over the trust, Brad and Chloe were not just inheriting the physical property. They were legally assuming all assets and all associated liabilities attached to that estate. I instructed Vivian to draft the immediate legally binding withdrawal of my personal surety. The second my father's lawyer filed the new trust documents at the county courthouse, officially transferring ownership to Brad and Chloe, my financial protection would completely evaporate. The commercial lenders had a strict change in control clause explicitly written into their contracts. Without my financial backing, the banks would instantly classify the $2 million construction debt as high risk. The entire balance would trigger an automatic technical default. The loan would be called in full. Brad and Chloe would not have months or even weeks to figure out a refinancing strategy. They would have exactly 24 hours to produce $2 million in liquid cash, or the bank would seize everything they had just signed their names to, including their own personal assets. I spent 4 hours in that high-rise office systematically signing away every ounce of my liability. I legally severed my personal bank accounts from the estate's payroll system. I canceled the massive auto drafts for the private nurses, the property taxes, and the utility bills, scheduling the cancellations to take effect the very minute the new trust was ratified. I legally amputated myself from the rotting corpse of my father's legacy. As I signed the final heavily notarized release form, my hand did not shake. I felt a profound electric surge of power coursing through my veins. I was not leaving them destitute out of blind malice or petty revenge. I was simply giving them exactly what they had aggressively demanded. They wanted the heavy gilded crown of the family empire. They were going to get the crushing weight of the kingdom that came with it. I drove back to the Buckhead mansion later that afternoon. The house was buzzing with a sickening celebratory energy. Brad was pacing the front lawn, talking loudly on his cell phone to his corporate contact at Sterling Corporate Holdings, excitedly confirming the exact acreage of the property for the impending sale. Chloe was in the formal living room, aggressively directing a team of luxury interior decorators she had prematurely hired to stage the house for a quick, highly profitable flip. They were spending money they did not even have yet, completely drunk on the illusion of their impending wealth. I walked right past them, acting completely invisible in my own childhood home. I went upstairs to my bedroom and began packing the very last of my essential files and personal items into a single sturdy suitcase. I moved quietly down the hall and glanced into the master suite. My father was sleeping peacefully in his medical bed, entirely ignorant of the fact that the two people he had chosen over me were currently plotting to dump him into a cheap state-funded facility by the end of the month. I looked at his resting face and felt absolutely no pity for him. He had deliberately built this toxic, superficial dynamic. He had raised a daughter who valued money over his life, and he had welcomed a son-in-law who viewed him as nothing more than a disposable stepping stone. Now he was going to reap the exact devastating harvest he had sown. Over the next 48 hours, I maintained an absolute terrifying silence. I played the role of the defeated, exhausted older sister to absolute perfection. I sat at the dining room table and let Brad mock my conservative financial strategies while he drank my father's expensive wine. I let Chloe make passive-aggressive insulting comments about my plain wardrobe and my lack of social grace. I absorbed every single insult, every condescending smirk, and every arrogant boast without a single word of retaliation. They mistook my silence for submission. They mistook my calmness for a complete lack of business acumen. They greedily counted down the hours until Friday, absolutely desperate to sign the legal paperwork that would officially kick me to the curb and crown them the new rulers of the estate. They were standing directly on the trapdoor, staring hungrily at the bait, and I was simply standing in the dark shadows with my hand resting firmly on the lever, waiting for the perfect ruinous moment to pull the trigger. 3 days had passed since I walked out the front door of the Buckhead mansion and left the heavy brass keys resting on my father's desk. 72 hours of absolute, uninterrupted silence on my end. I spent those 3 days in my downtown loft drinking black coffee, answering emails for my appraisal firm, and watching the final pieces of my legal trap lock firmly into place. I tracked the digital notifications from Vivian's office, confirming that the withdrawal of my personal financial guarantees had been processed and queued, waiting only for the official transfer of the estate to trigger the final detonation. Then the highly anticipated summons finally arrived. Brad did not call me directly, of course. He sent a sharply worded, legally intimidating email through my father's attorney, demanding my immediate presence at their Midtown law office. The email dictated that I was required to sign the final handover protocols, officially relinquishing any remaining ties to the estate, the trust, and the family business. Brad wanted to make absolutely certain that I could never return to claim a single penny of the $3 million he mistakenly believed he was about to pocket. I dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a sleek, tailored charcoal suit that projected pure, unbothered professionalism. I walked into the sprawling, glass-walled conference room 10 minutes early, taking a seat at the far end of the long mahogany table. I placed my pristine leather portfolio in front of me, folded my hands neatly in my lap, and waited for the show to begin. At exactly 2 o'clock, the heavy glass doors swung open. Brad marched into the room first, radiating the kind of aggressive, unearned confidence that only a mediocre man who thinks he just won the lottery can possess. He wore a custom navy blue suit and a platinum watch that caught the overhead lights, carrying himself like a conquering king, stepping into his newly acquired throne room. Chloe trailed right behind him, pushing my father's specialized wheelchair. She was dressed in an expensive cream-colored silk blouse and carried a massive designer handbag that she practically slammed onto the conference table to make sure everyone noticed it. My father sat stiffly in his chair, his face pulled into a harsh, uncompromising scowl. He looked at me not with the relief of a man whose financial future was supposedly secured, but with the bitter, resentful glare of a dictator viewing an exiled traitor. The elderly estate lawyer followed them in, looking deeply uncomfortable with the suffocating tension, clutching a thick stack of finalized trust documents. Brad did not even offer a polite greeting. He immediately took the seat directly across from me, spreading his arms wide and taking up as much physical space as possible. Chloe sat next to him, crossing her legs and giving me a tight, artificially sweet smile that failed to reach her cold eyes. Brad leaned forward, steepling his fingers together in a textbook power pose. He cleared his throat loudly, making sure the entire room was focused entirely on him. "We brought you here today to wrap up the loose ends, Naomi," Brad announced, his voice echoing with arrogant authority. He slid a thick-bound stack of papers across the polished mahogany table, stopping just inches from my folded hands. "Your father has officially ratified the new trust. Chloe and I are now the sole managing trustees of the estate and the corporate holdings. Because we are restructuring the entire operational model of the family business, we need you to sign these final non-disclosure and severance agreements. It is standard corporate procedure when transitioning executive management. We just want to ensure there is a clean, legally binding break so you do not try to interfere with our future acquisitions or demand compensation down the line. We are treating this exactly like a corporate buyout, and we are buying you out of the picture for $0. Chloe leaned in, resting her manicured hand on Brad's arm. We really are doing this for your own good, Naomi, she chimed in, her voice dripping with weaponized pity. You have been so incredibly stressed and bitter lately. Taking care of Daddy was clearly too much for you to handle, and your little real estate job was suffering because of it. Now you can finally move on. You can find a nice quiet apartment somewhere affordable and focus on getting your life back together without dragging our family name down with your constant negativity. We will not even ask you to reimburse the estate for the food and utilities you consumed while living under Daddy's roof. Consider it a parting gift. Brad smirked, picking up the narrative without missing a beat. Exactly, he agreed smoothly, adjusting his expensive tie. We have massive plans for the Buckhead property and the construction firm. We are bringing in elite venture capital partners from the West Coast. The scaling potential is absolutely massive, but it requires a ruthless visionary approach that you simply do not possess. We need to clear the dead weight from the capitalization table immediately. We are fast-tracking a total asset optimization strategy. Sign these papers, hand over any remaining corporate credit cards or access codes, and you can walk away free and clear. Do not make this difficult, Naomi. You do not want to go to war with a Silicon Valley financial team. You will lose everything. My father pounded his good fist on the armrest of his wheelchair, his patience snapping at the mere sound of my continued presence in the room. Stop wasting time explaining high-level strategy to her, Brad, my father barked harshly. She does not understand elite finance. She never has. Just put the pen in her hand and get her signature so we can get back to running my empire. She is holding up progress. I did not argue with a single word they said. I did not defend my highly successful career, and I certainly did not point out that the only reason this family even had a checking account was because of my grueling round-the-clock labor. I did not mention the crushing commercial debts or the triple-mortgaged mansion. I sat perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair, my expression remaining completely neutral and entirely unreadable. I watched Brad puff out his chest, completely drunk on the illusion of his own brilliance, spewing corporate buzzwords to mask his catastrophic ignorance. I watched Chloe adjust her expensive jewelry, already mentally spending the $3 million she believed she was about to extract from selling out her own father. I watched my father look at his son-in-law with profound respect, completely blind to the fact that Brad was actively planning to dump him into a state-run nursing home by the end of the month. They thought they were backing me into an inescapable corner. They thought they were dominating the room, flexing their superior intellect and forcing my total humiliating surrender. I just sat quietly, breathing evenly, watching them put on an arrogant, spectacular play. I was perfectly content to let them perform their self-righteous lines and bask in their fabricated victory. Knowing the trap was armed, the escape routes were sealed, and they were blindly tightening the financial noose around their own necks. I reached across the polished mahogany table and picked up the heavy gold pen Brad had aggressively shoved in my direction. I did not hesitate. I pulled the severance and non-disclosure agreements toward me, scanning the standard corporate boilerplate just to be absolutely certain they had not hidden any clawback clauses. They had not. The documents were a clean surgical break. By signing these pages, I was legally surrendering any future claim to the family trust, but I was also legally absolving myself of any future fallout. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name on the dotted line. Brad let out a sharp, victorious breath. He actually pumped his fist slightly, a subtle but deeply arrogant gesture of triumph. He thought he had just bullied me into submission. He thought my quiet compliance was the white flag of a defeated, bitter older sister who simply lacked the stomach for a corporate war. He eagerly snatched the signed papers back across the table, sliding them securely into his own leather folder, as if he had just captured a highly prized enemy flag. Now for the main event, Brad announced, rubbing his hands together. He turned his greedy, expectant gaze toward the elderly estate lawyer sitting at the end of the table. Let us get this trust transfer finalized so we can all move on with our lives. The lawyer looked distinctly uncomfortable. He cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled a massive 3-inch thick binder of legal documents from his briefcase. He placed the heavy stack directly in front of Brad and Chloe. This binder contained the entire legal architecture of the new family trust. It was the absolute transfer of power, handing over the Buckhead mansion, the family construction firm, and every single associated bank account. "Mr. Blackwell?" The lawyer began, his voice tight with professional hesitation. "As the incoming managing trustee, you and your wife are assuming total control of the estate. However, I must strongly advise that we take the time to review the liability assumption clauses detailed in Section 4. When transferring an active corporate entity and heavily leveraged physical real estate," Brad held up a flat, commanding hand, cutting the experienced attorney off mid-sentence. "Do not waste my time with standard boilerplate disclaimers." He snapped, his tone dripping with condescension. "I negotiate multi-million-dollar venture capital acquisitions in Silicon Valley every single week. I know exactly how a trust transfer operates. We are absorbing the assets. We are taking the keys. I do not need a local estate lawyer trying to rack up billable hours by reading me the fine print of my own family business. Just point to where we need to sign." The lawyer opened his mouth to protest, glancing nervously at my father, but Marcus simply nodded his approval toward Brad. Marcus loved seeing his son-in-law dominate the room. He viewed Brad's aggressive, dismissive behavior not as dangerous arrogance, but as the exact kind of ruthless, masculine leadership the family empire required. Marcus was completely blinded by his own toxic vanity, entirely unaware that the man he was trusting to protect his legacy was the exact same man plotting to sell his beloved mansion and dump him into a cheap state-run medical facility. "Fine," the lawyer conceded quietly, defeated by the sheer wall of arrogance sitting across from him. He flipped the heavy binder open to the signature pages, placing a blue sticky note next to every required line. Chloe went first. She grabbed the pen, her diamond rings catching the bright, fluorescent lights of the conference room. She did not read a single sentence. She was far too busy visualizing the massive, totally fabricated payday she believed was coming her way. She was practically vibrating in her seat, already mentally spending the $3 million from the secret off-market deal with Sterling Corporate Holdings. She signed her name with a dramatic, looping flourish on every single page the lawyer indicated, sealing her own fate with a perfectly manicured hand. Then it was Brad's turn. He took the pen from his wife, his pale blue eyes gleaming with sheer, unrestrained greed. He flipped through the thick stack of legal paper with rapid, careless movements. He was so incredibly eager to lock down the assets before my father could change his mind that he completely bypassed the financial disclosures. He skipped right over the operational addendums. He did not ask for a current balance sheet. He did not ask to see the company's accounts payable ledger. He operated on the fatal, arrogant assumption that a wealthy black patriarch living in a massive Buckhead estate must be sitting on a mountain of pure, unencumbered cash. I sat perfectly still, my breathing slow and measured, watching the ink flow from his pen. I watched him sign the transfer of deed. I watched him sign the corporate control handover. And then he flipped to the most critical document in the entire binder. It was titled, "Acceptance of All Assets and Financial Obligations." This was the specific legal instrument that explicitly transferred the crushing $2 million commercial debt load directly onto the shoulders of the new trustees. This was the document that legally bound Brad and Chloe to the triple-mortgaged mansion and the outstanding federal tax liens. By signing this specific piece of paper, Brad was personally guaranteeing the survival of a bankrupt company. He did not even pause to read the title. He just saw another signature line standing between him and his perceived victory. Brad pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name with aggressive, sweeping strokes. The trap slammed shut. The steel jaws locked firmly into place. Brad tossed the gold pen onto the mahogany table. It clattered loudly against the wood, signaling the official end of the transaction. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest, projecting the aura of a man who had just conquered the world. He looked at my father, nodding deeply. "The estate is secure, Marcus. You have absolutely nothing to worry about anymore. Chloe and I have taken on the full weight of the empire." Chloe beamed, squeezing Brad's arm tightly. "We did it," she whispered excitedly, completely oblivious to the catastrophic reality of what they had just done. My father let out a long, heavy sigh of relief. He looked at me, a cold, triumphant sneer spreading across his aging face. "It is done, Naomi. You have no power here anymore. You can leave now. We do not require your presence for the remainder of our family business." They all stared at me, waiting for me to stand up, hang my head in defeat, and walk out of the room empty-handed. They expected me to retreat into the shadows, thoroughly beaten and humiliated by their superior strategy. I did not move. I did not break eye contact with Brad. I slowly reached down and unclasped the polished silver buckle of my leather handbag. The sharp click echoed in the sudden heavy silence of the conference room. The ink was barely dry on the catastrophic legal documents Brad had just blindly signed. I reached inside my bag, my fingers brushing against the crisp edge of a sealed white envelope. It was time to show the arrogant venture capitalist exactly what kind of empire he had just purchased. I pulled the letter out and placed it squarely on the table. I slid the crisp white envelope across the polished mahogany table. It came to rest right on top of the newly signed trust binder. Brad stared down at the blank paper, his triumphant smirk momentarily faltering into a look of sharp annoyance. "What is this?" he demanded, refusing to pick it up. "If you are trying to hand me a list of demands for severance pay, you are wasting your time. I already told you we are buying you out for $0. "That is not a demand letter, Brad," I replied, leaning back in my leather chair and resting my hands on the armrests. "That is a formal, legally binding notification from First Georgia Commercial Bank. It was delivered to my private attorney this morning, and I am officially serving it to the new managing trustees of the estate. You should probably open it. It concerns the $3 million you and Chloe were planning to pocket by selling my father's house to Sterling Corporate Holdings." Chloe let out a sharp gasp, her manicured hand flying to her mouth. Brad's entire body went rigid. The arrogant, relaxed posture vanished instantly as he realized I knew all about his secret off-market deal. "How do you know about Sterling?" Brad snapped, his voice losing its smooth corporate polish. "I know everything," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, even register. "I know you plan to liquidate the estate. I know you plan to kick me out on the street. And I know you plan to dump your father-in-law into a cheap state-run nursing home by the end of the month so you could fly back to Silicon Valley as multimillionaires." My father's head snapped up. He looked at Chloe, his eyes wide with sudden, terrifying confusion. "Chloe, what is she talking about?" Chloe could not even look at him. She stared at the envelope on the table, her face draining of all color. "Do not listen to her, Marcus." Brad interrupted loudly, grabbing the envelope and tearing it open. "She is just throwing a bitter, desperate tantrum because she lost. She is trying to cause a family rift on her way out the door." Brad pulled the heavily stamped legal document from the envelope. He unfolded it and began to read. I watched his pale blue eyes dart back and forth across the page. I watched the exact second the arrogant venture capitalist realized he had just walked blindly into a financial slaughterhouse. "You thought you were inheriting a pristine gold mine, Brad," I stated, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the conference room. "You looked at this massive Buckhead mansion and saw unencumbered equity. You looked at the family construction firm and saw a thriving enterprise ready for a corporate buyout. But you never actually asked to see the balance sheets, did you? You were so incredibly desperate to lock me out of the trust that you skipped the financial disclosures entirely." Brad's hands began to shake. The thick paper rattled audibly in his grip. "Let me break down your new empire for you," I continued, speaking clearly and methodically. "That beautiful historic mansion you just claimed ownership of is not worth $3 million in pure cash. It has been mortgaged 3 separate times to pay off massive federal tax liens that my father hid from the world. The equity is entirely gone. In fact, it is negative. The house is a hollow shell." "That is a lie," Chloe practically screamed, slamming her hands on the table. "Daddy is wealthy. The business is successful." "The business is a black hole, Chloe," I corrected her sharply. "The family construction firm is currently carrying a $2 million commercial debt load. My father secretly bankrupted this company years ago to fund your luxury lifestyle and his country club memberships." Brad finally looked up from the document. His face was no longer smug. It was completely ashen. "This says the loan is in technical default," he whispered, his voice cracking with genuine panic. "This says the bank is calling the entire balance." "That is exactly what it says," I confirmed, offering him a razor-thin smile. For the past 3 years, the only reason that commercial loan was not called in was because my highly successful personal appraisal firm was acting as the sole financial guarantor. My pristine credit and my company's verified cash reserves were the only things keeping the bank from seizing the business and foreclosing on the mansion. But as of 20 minutes ago, when you officially registered that new trust, my personal surety was legally withdrawn. The elderly estate lawyer reached across the table and gently pulled the document from Brad's trembling hands. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, scanning the legal text. He let out a long, shaky breath and looked at my father with an expression of profound pity. "She is telling the truth, Marcus," the lawyer said quietly. "The change in control clause has been triggered. Because Naomi is no longer the guarantor, the bank has classified the construction debt as immediate high risk." "Then we will just restructure it," Brad stammered frantically, trying to piece his shattered ego back together. "I deal with debt restructuring all the time. I will call my guys in the valley. We will collateralize the remaining assets and refinance the loan." "You cannot restructure this, Brad," I said, leaning forward and resting my arms on the table. "You do not have a verified liquid history with this specific commercial lender in Georgia. They do not care about your Silicon Valley startups. They care about hard, tangible assets which you do not have here. Because you just aggressively signed the acceptance of all assets and financial obligations document, you personally guaranteed a failing enterprise. You literally just co-signed a $2 million debt." Brad's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The reality of the situation was crushing his chest. "And here is the absolute best part," I added, letting the victory ring clear as a bell in my voice. "Because the technical default was triggered by a hostile change in executive management, the bank is not giving you 30 days to figure it out. They are calling the loan in full. The entire $2 million balance matures exactly tomorrow morning." Chloe let out a high-pitched, hysterical sob. She grabbed Brad's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. "Brad, what does that mean? What is she saying?" Brad could not even look at his wife. He stared blindly at the mahogany table, his face turning a sickening pale shade of white. The confident, superior finance bro had completely vanished. In his place was a terrified man who had just realized he was going to lose his own personal savings, his own career, and everything he possessed because he had been too arrogant to read the fine print. "It means," Brad choked out, his voice barely a whisper, "that if we do not hand the bank $2 million in liquid cash by tomorrow morning, they are going to seize the house, seize the company, and come after my personal bank accounts to cover the difference." At the end of the table, my father let out a strange, strangled gasp. He raised his good hand, clawing desperately at the fabric of his shirt right over his heart. He looked at Brad, the son-in-law he had worshipped. He looked at Chloe, the golden child who had planned to throw him into a nursing home. Then he looked at me, the daughter he had abused, exploited, and discarded. His chest heaved as the full, devastating weight of his absolute ruin finally crashed down upon him. He clutched his chest, his eyes rolling back in severe, agonizing shock. Chloe let out a piercing shriek, completely abandoning her polished composure as she rushed toward my father's wheelchair. The elderly estate lawyer immediately pulled out his cell phone to dial emergency services, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device. My father was gasping for air, his face gray and entirely drenched in a sudden cold sweat. The sheer terror of his impending financial destruction was physically breaking his body right in front of us. But Brad did not look at his father-in-law. He did not rush to help the man whose legacy he had just proudly sworn to protect. Instead, Brad slowly stood up from his plush leather chair, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were bone white. His pale eyes locked onto mine, burning with the frantic, cornered energy of a trapped animal. The polished venture capitalist was gone. In his place was a desperate, ruined man who was watching his entire future burn to the ground. "You are bluffing!" Brad spat, his voice trembling with an explosive mixture of fear and absolute rage. You cannot do this. You cannot just pull the plug on a multi-million-dollar commercial loan overnight. There are legal protections. There are grace periods. I will sue you for everything you have. I will drag you through federal court for intentional financial sabotage. I remained perfectly still in my seat. You can try to sue me, Brad, I replied, my voice slicing through his frantic shouting with terrifying calmness. But you will be suing me with a bankrupt estate's money, which you do not have. You signed the liability transfer. You accepted the terms without reading the financial disclosures. My withdrawal of the personal guarantee was entirely legal and fully documented with the lender. You walked into this trap completely on your own 2 feet. Brad slammed both of his hands violently down onto the mahogany table. The heavy wood shuddered under the impact. If we go down, you go down with us, he roared, his voice cracking under the sheer volume of his panic. You think you are so brilliant, Naomi. You think you just pulled off the ultimate corporate execution. But you just burned down your own inheritance. If the bank seizes the company tomorrow morning, if they foreclose on this entire estate, you get absolutely nothing. You lose your father's wealth. You lose the family legacy. You walk away with $0. You destroyed us, but you left yourself completely empty-handed. You are just as bankrupt as we are. His voice echoed off the glass walls of the conference room, hanging in the air like a desperate prayer. He genuinely believed his own words. He needed to believe them, because the thought of my total victory was too agonizing for his fragile, arrogant ego to process. He wanted me to suffer the exact same catastrophic loss he was currently facing. Chloe stopped crying over our father for a brief second, looking up at me with tear-streaked makeup, desperately clinging to Brad's twisted logic. She wanted me to be just as ruined as they were. I looked at Brad, then shifted my gaze to Chloe, and finally let my eyes rest on my father, who was struggling to take shallow, ragged breaths in his wheelchair. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I leaned forward slowly, resting my forearms on the table, and let a genuine, chilling smile spread across my face. I am not walking away empty-handed, Brad, I said softly. In fact, I am walking away significantly wealthier than this family has ever been in its entire history. My father stopped gasping, his dark, terrified eyes locked onto my face. Do you remember exactly 3 months ago? I asked, addressing my father directly. Do you remember the afternoon I walked into the formal dining room and begged you to stop funding Chloe's lavish Malibu wedding? I had just taken out a second mortgage on my own downtown apartment to save your company from being seized by the IRS. I asked you for collateral to secure the massive debt I had just absorbed on your behalf. And do you remember what you threw at my face? My father swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. You laughed at me. I continued, my tone relentless and cold. You mocked me in front of Chloe. You told me I was a scavenger who lacked a true developer's vision. You signed over the deed to that 40-acre environmentally contaminated industrial plot on the outskirts of Atlanta. You called it a garbage dump. You told me to take it and shut my mouth because it had cost you more in municipal fines than it ever generated in revenue. You legally transferred the absolute ownership, all developmental rights, and the mineral rights directly into my personal limited liability company. You thought you were handing me a worthless liability just to get me out of your sight. Brad looked confused, his panic momentarily stalling. What does an abandoned chemical lot have to do with anything? He demanded, his voice defensive but laced with a growing, terrible dread. It has everything to do with my exit strategy, Brad, I replied, locking my eyes with his. Because what my father did not know, and what you failed to research, was the highly classified commercial zoning expansion happening in that exact district. I am a commercial real estate appraiser. I do not deal in flashy residential flips. I deal in massive global infrastructure. That so-called garbage dump is located directly adjacent to the new interstate commercial corridor. I reached into my leather portfolio one final time. I pulled out a single beautifully embossed sheet of paper and slid it across the table toward my father and Brad. It was a finalized, fully executed bill of sale. I did not keep the garbage dump, I stated, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision. 3 weeks ago, Amazon finalized their search for a new, massive regional fulfillment and logistics center. They needed 40 acres of industrial-zoned land with immediate highway access, and they needed it fast enough to bypass the standard city zoning board delays. My plot was the only property in the entire county that met their exact aggressive specifications. I watched Brad's eyes scan the bold print on the bill of sale. His jaw literally dropped open. I sold that toxic wasteland to Amazon for $15 million in pure, unencumbered cash. I announced, letting the massive number drop into the room like a heavy stone. The environmental cleanup costs were fully absorbed by their corporate development team. The transaction cleared escrow exactly 4 days ago. The federal and state capital gains taxes have already been fully paid and accounted for. The remaining net profit is currently sitting safely in my completely untraceable, heavily protected private trust account. I did not burn down my inheritance. I liquidated my portion early, and I took every single ounce of actual wealth this family possessed right out the front door with me. A suffocating, absolute moment of silence descended upon the conference room. It was not just quiet, it was the total atmospheric vacuum that follows a devastating explosion. The air was completely stripped of oxygen. Brad stared at the piece of paper, his entire body trembling violently. The arrogant hotshot venture capitalist had been utterly outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and financially slaughtered by the woman he had spent weeks calling a low-level conservative clerk. He had signed his name to a $2 million debt, while I had walked away with an 8-figure fortune. He staggered backward, his legs giving out completely, and collapsed into his leather chair. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a raw, pathetic sound of total despair. Chloe was completely paralyzed. The reality of her situation had finally broken through her delusion. There would be no $3 million payout. There would be no luxury life in Silicon Valley. She was chained to a bankrupt company, a mountain of immediate debt, and a husband whose career was effectively over. She stared at me, her eyes wide, empty, and brimming with sheer terror. And my father, the proud, ruthless patriarch who had valued his public image above his own flesh and blood. He slumped sideways in his specialized wheelchair, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked at the $15 million bill of sale, realizing that his greatest professional failure had secretly been his greatest asset. And he had given it away to the daughter he despised simply because he was too arrogant to see her true worth. The complete collapse of the villain faction was total and irreversible. They were trapped in their self-made financial grave, and I was the one holding the shovel. The silence shattered the moment Chloe found her voice. It was not her usual performative whimper meant to garner sympathy from our father. It was a raw, guttural scream that tore through the sterile, air-conditioned atmosphere of the conference room. She lunged across the polished mahogany, her perfectly manicured hands swiping wildly at the air, as if she could physically tear the $15 million bill of sale right out of my hands. I simply leaned back in my chair, pulling the document safely out of her reach, and watched her descend into absolute, uncontrollable hysteria. "You are a monster!" Chloe shrieked, her face contorting into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You are completely cold-blooded. How could you do this to your own flesh and blood? We are your family, Naomi. You are literally leaving us to die in the street while you walk away a multi-millionaire. You are sick and evil for setting us up like this." I looked at my younger sister, taking in the designer silk blouse and the expensive diamond rings she had purchased on our father's dying credit. My expression did not soften by a single fraction of an inch. "I am cold-blooded," I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register that forced everyone in the room to freeze and lean in. That is a truly fascinating accusation, coming from the woman who sat in her father's kitchen less than a week ago, drinking his expensive vintage champagne, and casually plotting to dump his paralyzed body into a cheap state-run nursing home. Chloe froze instantly. The screaming stopped dead in her throat. The color entirely drained from her tear-stained face as she realized I had heard every single word of her late-night conspiracy. "Yes, Chloe," I continued, my gaze pinning her to the chair. I know all about your brilliant master plan to pocket $3 million and abandon Marcus to Medicaid the exact second the ink was dry on this trust. You wanted to sell the family estate out from under him, kick me to the curb with 24 hours' notice, and fly back to California without a second thought. Do not you dare stand there and lecture me about family loyalty. You were going to throw him away like absolute garbage. I just beat you to the punch. I simply took my cut, packed my bags, and stepped completely out of the blast radius. Beside her, Brad was physically unraveling. The polished, aggressive venture capitalist had been reduced to a shaking, hyperventilating shell of a man. He pulled his latest smartphone from his custom suit jacket with trembling fingers, desperately swiping at the bright screen. He was muttering under his breath, frantically trying to pull up his personal banking apps, trying to calculate exactly how fast the commercial lenders were going to freeze his assets. I need to call Sterling Corporate Holdings. Brad stammered, his pale eyes wide and entirely unfocused. I need to call my partners in the valley. We can leverage my personal equity. We can file for an emergency injunction against the bank. We can claim fraud. We can tell the judge you intentionally hid the commercial liabilities during the transfer. I let out a soft, sharp laugh that cut right through his rising panic. You can certainly try, Brad, but you will be laughed straight out of federal court before lunchtime. You did not hire an independent auditor. You explicitly declined to review the balance sheets. In front of multiple witnesses, including a licensed estate attorney, you aggressively demanded to skip the financial disclosures because you loudly claimed you were too smart and too experienced to read the fine print. You signed a legally binding acceptance of all financial obligations with zero coercion. I did not hide the debt. You were just entirely too arrogant to look for it. Brad dropped his phone. It clattered loudly against the heavy wooden table. The reality of his catastrophic error was officially cementing itself into his brain. He was not just losing the Buckhead mansion and the dream of a quick $3 million flip. The commercial lenders were going to ruthlessly liquidate the family construction firm tomorrow morning, and when that liquidation fell short of the $2 million balance, they were coming straight for him. They would seize his luxury cars, drain his investment portfolios, and garnish his future earnings. His entire career in the elite tech startup scene was instantly vaporized. No venture capital firm in the country would ever hire a financial executive who had blindly co-signed a defaulted multi-million-dollar commercial loan without performing basic due diligence. His reputation as a brilliant financial strategist was permanently annihilated. He was professionally, socially, and financially dead. He slumped forward, burying his face into his hands, pulling violently at his perfectly styled hair as a low, pathetic groan escaped his throat. And then there was my father. The man who had spent 32 years treating me like a highly disposable asset. The patriarch who had built a celebrated empire through sheer force of will only to blindly hand the keys over to the two people who actively plotted his demise. He sat slumped in his specialized wheelchair, his breathing shallow and incredibly rapid. He did not yell. He did not pound his fist on the table or demand my immediate obedience. The arrogant fire that had fueled his entire existence was completely extinguished. Marcus slowly turned his head to look at me. For the very first time in my entire life, I did not see contempt in his dark eyes. I did not see judgment, disgust, or profound disappointment. I saw absolute crushing despair. He looked at the daughter he had abandoned emotionally, the daughter he had used as a human shield against the IRS, and he finally realized the monumental magnitude of his failure. He saw that I was the only person in this room who had ever possessed the true killer instinct he so highly valued. He realized that the grit, the brilliance, and the ruthless business acumen required to save his legacy had been sitting right in front of him for 3 years, changing his bedpans and paying his property taxes. I was the true heir to his empire. But instead of nurturing that potential, he had actively tried to destroy it to protect his own toxic vanity and his blatant favoritism toward Chloe's superficial lifestyle. He had chosen the validation of a wealthy white son-in-law over the fierce loyalty of his own black daughter, and it had cost him everything. Naomi, my father wheezed, his voice frail, broken and stripped of all its former terrifying power. Please, You cannot leave me with them. You know what they will do to me now. You heard them. You have $15 million in liquid cash. You have the vast resources to fix this. You are my daughter. I am begging you to help me." The great Marcus, a man who had never apologized a single day in his life, was officially begging for my mercy. He was pleading with the very same daughter he had told to shut up and take his garbage dump just a few months prior. He was desperately hoping that the familial duty he had weaponized for so long would somehow magically activate and save him from the absolute ruin he had actively curated. I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my charcoal suit, and picked up my leather portfolio. I looked down at the broken, desperate man in the wheelchair. I felt the final lingering threads of my childhood trauma sever completely, leaving behind nothing but a cool, unbothered peace. "I was your daughter, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing with an absolute chilling finality. "I was the daughter who stayed up all night keeping your company from foreclosure. I was the daughter who mortgaged her own home to pay your federal taxes. I was the daughter who kept you alive when no one else cared. But you made it abundantly clear that my loyalty meant absolutely nothing to you. You chose your legacy and you chose them. Now you get to live with the exact family you built." Belated regret cannot salvage the reality of what they had done. No amount of screaming from Chloe, no amount of desperate financial calculations from Brad, and no amount of pathetic, heartbreaking apologies from my father could rewind the clock. The ink was dry. The transfer was complete. The trap had successfully triggered. They were standing in the smoldering wreckage of their own profound greed, staring up at the woman they had foolishly tried to bury. I pushed my chair back, the harsh scrape of wood against the floor, breaking through the heavy, suffocating panic filling the conference room. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my charcoal suit, and picked up my leather portfolio. Every single movement I made was deliberate and completely unbothered. I looked down at the three people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. They looked absolutely pathetic. Chloe scrambled out of her chair, her designer heels stumbling on the carpet. She lunged toward me, her tear-streaked face twisted into a mask of pure desperation. "Naomi, please," she sobbed, reaching out to grab my arm. "You cannot just leave us like this. We are sisters. We grew up together. I am sorry for everything I said. I will cancel the Malibu wedding. I will return the dresses. We can use that money to negotiate with the bank. You have $15 million. You have more than enough to pay off the commercial lenders and save the estate. We can be a real family again. I promise I will be better." I stepped back easily, dodging her grasp. "Do not touch me, Chloe," I said, my voice ringing with absolute icy authority. "You do not get to play the sister card now that your bank account is empty. You did not think of me as your sister when you were draining our father's last savings account to buy imported silk centerpieces. You did not think of me as a sister when you sat in the kitchen planning to throw me out on the street. You are not sorry for how you treated me. You are only sorry that your golden ticket just turned out to be an explosive trap. You can keep the Malibu wedding, assuming you can still find a way to pay the caterers tomorrow morning. I am not giving you a single cent." My father wheeled his chair forward, his hands trembling violently. "Naomi, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice cracking with the undeniable terror of a man facing total ruin. "You are a brilliant woman. You proved your point. You showed us that you are the smartest person in this room. But this is my legacy. This company is our family name. You cannot let the bank take everything I built. I am your father. I gave you life. You owe me the basic respect of protecting this bloodline." I looked down at the man who had verbally abused me, financially exploited me, and tried to strip me of my dignity for 32 years. "You owe me nothing, Marcus," I replied, my tone flat and entirely devoid of emotion. "I spent 3 years giving you everything. I gave you my youth. I gave you my peace of mind. I gave you my financial security. I protected your legacy while you constantly reminded me that I was a failure because I did not look like a beauty queen. I did not execute this real estate deal to teach you a lesson or to prove my intelligence. I did it because it was a necessary business transaction." I looked around the room, making sure my final words landed with lethal precision. You forced me to mortgage my own home to save yours. I simply secured a hard asset as collateral, waited for the market to shift, and liquidated my position for a maximum return on investment. I did not destroy you. I did not orchestrate your bankruptcy. I just stopped being your human shield. You and your arrogant son-in-law destroyed yourselves with your own unyielding greed. I am simply recovering the capital, the time, and the energy you stole from me. This is not revenge. This is debt collection. And your account is officially closed. Brad was still sitting at the mahogany table, his head buried in his hands, completely paralyzed by the impending destruction of his Silicon Valley career. He did not even look up as I turned my back on them. I walked toward the heavy glass doors of the conference room. I did not speed up my pace. I did not look over my shoulder to check on their tears. My posture was perfectly straight, my head held high. I had survived the toxic hellscape they created, and I had emerged entirely victorious. "Naomi, do not walk out that door," my father croaked behind me, his voice a pathetic, wheezing gasp. "If you leave this room, you are dead to me. You will never be part of this family again." I placed my hand on the cool metal handle of the door. I pushed it open and stepped out into the quiet, pristine hallway of the law office. I looked back at them one final time, taking in the beautiful, catastrophic wreckage of their greed. "I have not been part of your family for a very long time," I said softly. I stepped through the threshold, let go of the handle, and pulled the heavy glass door firmly behind me. The heavy slam of the door echoed down the corridor, ringing out like a judge's final gavel, marking the absolute permanent end of a toxic relationship. The heavy glass door sealed shut, cutting off the frantic, suffocating panic that had consumed the conference room. I stood in the quiet, carpeted hallway of the law firm, the sudden silence wrapping around me like a protective shield. There were no more demands. There were no more insults. For the first time in 32 years, my lungs expanded fully, pulling in air that did not belong to my father. I adjusted the strap of my leather portfolio, feeling the satisfying weight of the documents inside, and walked toward the elevators. My footsteps were steady and measured, echoing with the rhythm of a woman who had just successfully executed the most critical negotiation of her entire life. The mirrored elevator doors slid open, and as I stepped inside, I caught my own reflection in the polished glass. I did not look like the exhausted, overworked caregiver who had spent 3 years scrubbing floors, managing pill organizers, and sacrificing her youth for a man who despised her. The dark circles under my eyes had vanished. The permanent heavy slump of my shoulders was completely gone. I looked exactly like the formidable, sharp-minded executive I had been forced to become. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal suit, watching the floor numbers flash in descending order, taking me further and further away from the toxic wreckage I had left on the 50th floor. The elevator chimed at the lobby level. I walked past the marble security desk, pushing through the heavy revolving doors and stepping over the final threshold between my oppressive past and my limitless future. I stepped out into the blazing, unforgiving heat of a Georgia afternoon. The Atlanta sun beat down fiercely, baking the concrete sidewalks and casting brilliant, blinding reflections off the towering glass skyscrapers of Midtown. The oppressive humidity that usually stifled the city felt entirely different today. It felt warm, vibrant, and incredibly alive. The ambient noise of the city, the blaring horns of taxis, the distant wail of sirens, the rhythmic thrum of traffic moving along Peachtree Street washed over me in a massive, glorious wave. It was the sound of a world rushing forward, a world I was finally free to conquer on my own terms. If this were a movie, this would be the exact moment the camera slowly pulls back, rising high above the busy street to capture the sweeping, majestic skyline of the city, showing one solitary woman standing tall and victorious against the massive, sprawling concrete jungle. The frame would widen, making the towering corporate buildings look small compared to the sheer magnitude of the freedom radiating from her posture. I walked slowly toward the edge of the curb, letting the reality of my absolute financial and emotional independence settle deep into my bones. For my entire life, my father had tried to convince me that I lacked the killer instinct required to build and maintain an empire. He believed that because I possessed basic human empathy, because I was willing to sacrifice my own comfort to care for a sick old man, I was inherently weak. He equated ruthlessness with intelligence, assuming that the only way to win in this brutal world was to aggressively crush the people beneath you. He had taught Chloe and Brad to view life through that exact same toxic, predatory lens. They genuinely believed that family was just another corporate asset to be leveraged, stripped of its equity, and discarded the very second it ceased to be profitable. They wanted the heavy gilded crown of wealth, but they absolutely refused to carry the grueling weight of the responsibility that came with it. But they had severely miscalculated the fundamental difference between cruelty and self-defense. I did not engineer their catastrophic downfall. I did not actively plot to bankrupt the family construction firm, and I did not orchestrate the bank calling in that massive commercial loan. I simply stood up, stepped entirely out of the line of fire, and let the crushing weight of their own monumental greed pull them straight down to the bottom of the ocean. They dug their own financial grave with their blinding arrogance, and I simply refused to jump into the hole with them. I did not trample on a single person to secure my $15 million fortune. I appraised a discarded toxic plot of land, recognized its true hidden value, and negotiated a brilliant, highly legitimate corporate acquisition. I played the game with absolute integrity, relying on my own sharp mind, my relentless work ethic, and my unwavering patience. I proved that you do not have to become a monster to defeat one. You just have to be smart enough, patient enough, and brave enough to never let anyone take advantage of your loyalty again. I made a silent, ironclad vow to myself right there on the sun-baked sidewalk. I would never again act as a human shield for people who only viewed me as collateral damage. I would never again allow the concept of family duty to be weaponized against my own survival. I was going to build an empire that dwarfed anything my father had ever created, but my empire would be rooted in genuine respect, actual equity, and uncompromising boundaries. I would lift up those who earned my trust, but I would absolutely annihilate anyone who tried to exploit my kindness. A sleek midnight black Maybach pulled smoothly up to the curb directly in front of me, its heavily tinted windows gleaming in the intense afternoon sunlight. The engine purred with a quiet, expensive power that commanded immediate respect from the surrounding traffic. The uniformed driver, a professional I had hired earlier that morning through an elite concierge service, immediately stepped out of the vehicle and opened the rear passenger door for me. He offered a polite, respectful nod, treating me not as a subordinate or a bitter afterthought, but as the powerful multi-million-dollar executive I truly was. I paused for a single fraction of a second, resting my hand on the cool metal of the luxury car door. I looked back up at the towering glass building I had just exited. Up there, in a soundproof conference room, 3 people were currently drowning in the toxic, inescapable wreckage of their own arrogant choices. They were desperately scrambling to salvage a legacy built entirely on lies, manipulation, and profound selfishness. But their frantic panic was no longer my problem. Their crushing commercial debts were no longer my burden. The heavy, suffocating chains of my history had been completely vaporized. I turned my face back toward the bright, blinding sun. A slow, radiant, and entirely unburdened smile broke across my face. It was the smile of a woman who had walked barefoot through a fiery hell, completely outsmarted the devil, and emerged on the other side entirely victorious. I slid into the plush custom leather seat of the luxury car, placing my portfolio safely on the seat beside me. The driver closed the door with a solid, satisfying thud, sealing me inside a quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary where the noise of my past could no longer reach me. As the driver smoothly accelerated, merging the powerful car seamlessly into the bustling, vibrant traffic of Atlanta, I did not look back. The dark, oppressive shadows of my history faded away in the rearview mirror, and I was carried forward, accelerating straight toward a brilliant, limitless future.